With this video, we shift our attention to American popular music, that is, to music that is defined by its dissemination to the masses, generally for at least partly commercial purposes. I remind you how we've thought about popular music as interacting with folk music and classical music, and I encourage you to think about the extent to which we've seen all three categories in jazz. We might expect to see continued interaction between the categories as we study pop and rock, albeit perhaps with different emphases. Popular music became increasingly socially and culturally significant in the 20th century with the rise of technology that could spread music to large numbers of people across wide geographic areas. In the United States, this became especially significant in the 1920s with the rise of radio networks that broadcast the same programming across the country. These consisted of what we call clear channel stations and X stations. The new sound films of the 1930s also captured musical topics, and that was another way in which music was disseminated. And in the 1930s and 40s, recording companies such as RCA Victor, Columbia, Decca, and Capitol put out increasing numbers of phonograph records. By the 1950s, more American homes had a television, and on these televisions, people would watch special variety shows that presented the newest musical talents out there. Perceptions of popularity can be subjective. For this reason, we like to ground our studies in as much quantitative data as possible. One measure of a music's popularity has been its position on the Billboard charts. The Billboard magazine calculated its first popularity chart for songs available as singles in 1940. They considered how many disc jockeys had played it on the radio, how many times it had been selected on jukeboxes, and how many copies of it had been sold. Eventually, separate charts were developed for different styles of music. As just noted, popularity can be tracked by album sales. Starting in the 1950s, the Recording Industry Association of America, or the RIAA, started awarding gold records for recordings which had sold at least 500,000 copies. These records give us a sense of how many copies of music were in circulation, although they cannot tell us how much a recording was listened to once it was purchased. Sometimes it's easy to forget that popular music was going strong even before Elvis became a teenage heartthrob in the 1950s. Check out these hits by Judy Garland, Bing Crosby, and Frank Sinatra on your playlist. This slide lists the top 10 hits of 1950. The singles in red are those which reflect country music sensibilities, and more on that in a moment. The tunes in blues are influenced by the blues, which of course we've already talked about. You can listen to all these recordings on your playlist. Country music, as captured on phonograph records and played over the airwaves, saw many hits by the 1930s. Particularly important was the start of the Grand Ole Opry, a radio show featuring live country music that was based in Nashville. It was broadcast across the country. We've already talked about the Carter family and their Can the Circle Be Unbroken. Jimmie Rodgers, sometimes referred to as the father of country music, was another very influential representative. Make sure to listen to his Blue Yodel, which is also known as T for Texas, on your playlist. Note that it is in 12-bar blues form and features Rodgers' famous yodeling. During the 1930s and 1940s, country music merged with popular cowboy songs and western swing. Some of the sounds of this new country and western can be heard in Hank Williams' hit Hey Look Good Looking from 1951. Note in particular the fiddle and the lap guitar interludes in this 32-bar form tune as you listen to it on your playlist. Les Paul was an important American guitarist, songwriter, and inventor. His inventions focused on electronic sound, and he is perhaps best known for having designed and convinced the Gibson Company to produce some of the first solid-body guitars. The sound waves created by a solid-body guitar are smaller and more unidirectional than those created by an acoustic guitar, and this means that there's less extraneous noise when solid-body guitars are plugged into an amplifier. You can amplify acoustic instruments as well, of course, but there's always the danger that the sound waves that are bouncing around within the resonating chamber of the instrument will interfere with those created by the amplifier. Les Paul was also one of the first to manipulate tape in order to produce overdubbing and multi-track recording, as well as tape delay and phasing. In overdubbing and multi-track recording, sounds are captured in separate microphones, either one by one or in a synchronous manner. Then the sounds are superimposed upon each other, so it is as if they were being performed simultaneously. His version of How High the Moon, which he recorded with his then-wife Mary Ford, was released in 1951 and spent several weeks at the #1 position on the Billboard charts. He uses overdubbing so that it sounds like there are several female vocalists singing at once and several guitars playing at once. Make sure to watch them perform on your YouTube playlist. Rhythm and blues, or R&B, developed in the late 1940s as blues-related popular music that was marketed for the most part to urban African Americans. Early R&B musicians included Louis Jordan, Big Mama Thornton, and Big Joe Turner. You can see Turner at the top right of your screen with his producers from Atlantic Records, a new record company in the 40s. They were Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler. A related genre of soul is often thought to have emerged with Ray Charles's recording of I've Got a Woman. Charles and others started by playing R&B, and then they took sounds typically found in African American gospel music, such as hand claps and call and response, and applied them to secular texts. In some cases, the texts used language to describe sacred love of God and tweaked it in order to apply it to human love. The mixing of sacred and secular created controversy among those who first listened to soul. Make sure you listen to I Got a Woman on your playlist. Finally, remember that the Chicago and electric blues tradition that we've already noted in the music of Muddy Waters, Otis Redding, and Etta James was also very popular at the time. Rhythm and blues provided one of the major impulses for early rock and roll, which we'll be talking about in the next video. In fact, many early rock and roll hits were covers of R&B songs. Hound Dog, which was written by the songwriting team of Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, was first released by Big Mama Thornton in 1953. Her version spent 7 weeks at #1 on the Billboard R&B charts. Elvis Presley's version of Hound Dog, released in 1956, would turn out to be the singer's best-selling record. It spent 11 weeks at the #1 position on the Billboard pop charts. For a period of time, Hound Dog by Presley was simultaneously #1 on the pop, country, and R&B charts. Comparing and contrasting Thornton's and Elvis's versions of Hound Dog will give us a sense of how R&B standards were changed into R&R hits. The text and the lyrics are always a good place to start. Note how the lyrics that Thornton sings are a bit more rough around the edges than the words Elvis would use. In particular, the sexual innuendo found in R&B tunes was and still is generally more explicit than that found in early rock and roll songs. Thornton's slow tempos and earthy vocal timbres, in addition to the hound calls in the bridge section, might also be heard as reflecting a more sexualized interpretation. The faster tempos of Elvis's version almost changed the song into a dance number, perhaps even appropriate for group dancing at a high school formal. Elvis's performances of Hound Dog on national television in the summer of 1956 dramatically reflect the controversy and fear that would accompany the birth of rock and roll. In June 1956, Elvis performed Hound Dog on The Milton Berle Show. This is one of those variety shows I talked about earlier. In the final verse, Elvis exaggerated his dance moves. These are the moves that would earn him the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. And in the background of the Berle Show recording, you can hear the screams of the adolescent girls in the audience. Among the 40 million people who saw this performance were many objectors, and they bombarded the broadcasting network NBC with letters of protest. So when Elvis appeared on the Steve Allen Show only a month later, he was required to wear a set of tails, and he was made to sing Hound Dog to a top hat wearing basset hound, and you can see a still image from the broadcast on the screen. Here, as well as in other later broadcasts of Elvis, the camera kept its focus on Elvis's upper half, not showing much below his waistline. As noted earlier in this class, although the 1950s were in many ways the decade of Ozzie and Harriet and a return to normalcy after World War II, they were also a time of growing conservatism and a fair amount of fear and racial tension. This might be seen in the popular films of the time, from Blackboard Jungle to James Dean's famous Rebel Without a Cause. Controversy over issues of race and morality accompany not only these films, but also the music of the time, and have continued to accompany the reception of much popular music and rock since this time. We end with a couple of questions such as those you might find on the Rock and Pop exam. After a pause, I will reveal the answers, and after you have reviewed the answers, proceed to our next video about early rock and roll. So pausing for a second so you can pause your video. Okay, the first question, Hank Williams is most closely associated with what? The correct answer is C, country and western music. Sometimes they'll abbreviate that C and W. Answer to the second question, who first performed Hound Dog? Yes, this was a Big Mama Thornton, who received the song from Leiber and Stoller, and then it was covered by Elvis some 3 years later. See you in the next video.